something to be aware of. You guys are welcome to use the raise your hand feature if you have a question. Sometimes if I'm navigating notes, I won't actually notice if you raise your hand. So if I don't call on you within a reasonable amount of time, please just speak up so I know if you have a question. But it's important to me that we can get your questions answered. I'm not going to know the answers to all your questions. So I guess I haven't actually introduced myself because we do have some people on here that I haven't met. This is our first morning or evening session time, depending on where you're at in the world. So thank you for your patience. I know a lot of you have been waiting for a time like this for a while. So good job continuing to study. And some of you have really made an effort to show up at those other times that were not convenient for you. So good job. My name is Josh. I am a CISSP certified, not an instructor, but I am a CISSP certified. And I also teach at a university. I have my master's in cybersecurity. And I am here in part to learn how to teach. If you're going to have questions, I may or may not know the answer. We're going to do our best to learn together. I do want to acknowledge right off the bat that last week I made a mistake in how I answered a question. I'm going to show you a different way of how I'm going to do it. We're not going to spend a lot of time on NAT traversal, but it was an issue in our last week's study group where we got a little sidetracked on it and didn't get to spend some time on practice questions. That was just a learning mistake on my part. So we'll jump into that as kind of our first point, but I want to pause. We have some people that have tests coming up. I'd love to know about successes or challenges that you're having. That could be specific topics, could be study techniques, anything like that. I just want to kind of have an open field if you guys want to share anything that you've been working on. I'm going to take a look through the class list here too, because I see some people on here. Deepu and Girish, it's great to see you. Muftau, I don't think I've met you guys. Robert, I'm not positive I've actually met you yet, unless in the community itself. Roshan.
No, I just found you guys a couple of days ago, actually. So right, as I was doing, research for CISSP, I came across your group, asked to join. Right.
Glad to
I
have
just finished with a 3-month-long cybersecurity skilling academy for CISA.
Very nice.
Yeah, so I graduated, and the deliverable for that course was the Security Plus. I took it last week, passed it, which I passed the 601 years ago, right? This was the 701.
Okay. Well done. That's an easy one.
This will be the second time that I've taken the CISSP. The first time I passed 7 of the 8 domains. And of course, right, if you were to ask me which domain of the 8 I was confident 100%, right, I'd laid 20-1 odds. It would have been the one that I didn't pass. All right, the first domain, right?
Yeah.
Which is, security this, security that, right? So yeah, so I came close the last time.
Well, good for you being willing to take it again. That's not an easy thing to do.
I'm going to keep taking it till I pass, right? I mean,
good for you.
I work for the VA as a customer IP tech right now. So they give us, right, we get basically one crack at a class per year. So the last 2 years has been the CISSP, and right, so they give you a week-long boot camp and then take the test. But I'll say the boot camps are not, at least the ones I've gone to. The first one was more of a teaching towards passing the test.
Yeah.
Which is I sort of feel like why I came very, very close. It was weird because, right, I made it all the way to question 150, and they tried spoon feeding me a win at the end. And the last 4 questions I got, right, but I wouldn't have made it that far had I not still been able to pass, right?
Yeah.
And of course, at that time, I didn't know I was passing 7 of the 8 domains, and they were trying to clear me up on the last one. And so the 4 questions I got were, which NIST 800 publication deals with policies, procedures, guidlines, and standards.
Nice.
Right. So that was the one thing that I sort of intentionally did not bother to memorize, because I figured they were never going to ask me a question that is that easy on the test. Mm-hmm. Right. But at the end, they tried to spoon feed me a win, and I I guessed, right, because I didn't know. I couldn't eliminate two answers, right? It was just 800 dash this, or this. And
Yes.
yeah, I came very, very close and then got tripped up at the end by easy questions, right?
Yeah. It's hard. It's the adaptive piece of the exam is really challenging.
Well,
So
that was the other part of it, right? Coming out the gate, I think I answered the first 20 questions correctly because I was thinking to myself, man, I don't think I've missed a question yet. And then the
nice.
test went into super hard mode on me, and I started seeing things that I had no clue about, right? And then so when I took it the last time, right, they gave you those, or they had those 50, I don't know how else to put it other than test questions, bullshit questions in there, right? And that just eats up a lot of your mental endurance, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah. Well, just as an encouragement to you, Robert, and on Tuesday's group, one of our members, Will Babb, who's been studying with us for a while, I think he went through one of our boot camps as well. Is that right, Vincent? Didn't Will go through a boot camp?
Yeah, Will did take the last boot camp.
Yeah, nice. So he had failed his first exam, passed on his second, and he said when he finished, he didn't think he passed at all. I think it ended on question 100, and he was sure he failed. So you just never know. It's a challenging exam. So that's great. Good job studying and going back for round two. Keep engaging in the Skool community. Everyone has been through this. We're all working professionals. So typically people will have a strength in a couple of domains. They'll be pretty comfortable in some that they just need to study, but there's usually two or three that are the tricky ones. For me, it's software development. I haven't worked in software, so I don't have the experience to draw on. Sometimes that can be advantageous. You guys have heard about thinking like a manager versus a technician. That is easier to do studying than it is through experience. You get enough experience as a technician and you start to want to answer from that level. So it can be helpful sometimes coming in without experience to some of these domains, especially if they are challenging for you. So our agenda for today, I mentioned we're going to talk about NAT traversal for just a couple of minutes so I can clean that up with you guys. And then we're focusing on authentication protocols. There's a principle that we're going to talk about, the tokenization. And it's used in a lot of different processes. It might go with different names and different variations of the techniques, but it's really token-based authentication. How does this work? So we're going to have that be our main focus. We do have some time for the practice questions at the end. And as always, ask questions. So to pause on this slide, again, last week we had a question about NAT traversal. We were meaning just to have kind of a simple discussion about network address translation. There were some great questions, but my commitment is when I get a question, I want to be able to give you guys a quality answer. And I ended up spending too much time on that, going into some unrelated topics. So in the future, the way I'm going to handle that is if I can't give you a good answer, or I'm not prepared to give a quality answer right now, even if I just don't have visual content that would make it easier, then I'm just going to post something in the Skool platform or pause it for next week. So in Skool, I posted this a few days ago, but I'm going to put a link in the chat as well here. And Robert, yeah, we'll do some practice questions. I'll share those in the session here. So I just shared a link to a Notion page that has some information. You can see a screenshot of it there. It's got a YouTube video and some information. So if you want to go deeper into NAT traversal, go for it. What I want you to understand for the exam is, I mean, you can see the port number there. You can memorize that. But what NAT traversal does is it makes using NAT easier, especially when we're doing VPNs. The reason for that is network address translation. When we pass through our firewall or our router, whatever device is going to be performing that action, it changes the source and destination IP. That's not an issue normally if we're passing through the same device that has a memory and is set up to do network address translation. However, when you're using a VPN, when that IP gets changed, the device doesn't necessarily know it, or the endpoint to the client doesn't when they're communicating. Causes some issues. So NAT traversal is a way to get around that. Essentially, we take the original packet, and instead of just changing the source and destination IP inside that packet, we encapsulate it inside of a UDP packet. So you can see the default port for that UDP. The reason it's UDP is because we don't want interruption and validation. We want it to be connection-less versus connection-oriented, just because there's a lot of delay and latency that gets introduced for something like this when we already have some extra overhead. The other important thing to know about NAT traversal is that it is only possible if the physical device is actually capable of that. So really important to be aware of. Not all routers or firewalls are capable of NAT traversal. So just something to be aware of there for the exam, but there's not anything else we're going to go into on that. If you do have more questions, reach out to me directly or post something in the Skool community. But bottom line is, in the future, this is how I'd like to approach questions I'm not ready to answer yet. Okay, let's dive into authentication protocols. First of all, we're in cybersecurity. You guys have all heard the term CIA, the CIA Triad. Who wants to pop up and tell me what that is? Ryan, yeah, I see your hand raised. Fire away, buddy.
Confidentiality, integrity, availability.
Excellent. If you were to sum up our job in cybersecurity, that is our job, the CIA Triad. Now, when we're talking about IAAA, you'll hear it most often as like authentication, authorization, and accountability. We tack on the identification piece as kind of a preliminary stage, and you'll see how this plays in. But AAA, you'll see that, or you'll see it with the I tacked on beforehand. All it is we're going to go through a process where we need to verify someone's identity. If they want to gain access to a resource or perform some specific action, join our network, anything like that, interacts with another organization potentially, we'll be talking about federated identity, we need to validate someone's identification as the first piece. Show me your ID. The authentication piece is the next step in that is, okay, you showed me your ID. I'm going to make sure that you and your ID actually match. A lot of the times this takes place with multi-factor authentication. So you guys are all comfortable with the fact of, or with multi-factor authentication. So I have just a quick quiz question for you. If I am required when I authenticate to use my username and password, and then I get to an MFA prompt that asks me for my PIN number, is that proper multi-factor authentication or not? I'm using two factors, username, credential, and PIN. Wilbert, yeah, no. Tell me why, if you don't mind coming off mic. If not, then someone else can jump in. Something you know, exactly. So the factors, that's the important word. We think factor and we might just think, I have to do it multiple times. Multi-factor. The multi refers to the factor. Something you know is, like Wilbert called out, it would be a credential, username, password, a PIN. But we need something additional, like something you have. That could be a token. It could be your phone with the multi-factor authentication app. It could be somewhere you are physically, like locked down to an IP address or even a geo bubble, things like that. It could be things what you are, so biometrics at that stage. There's a lot of really amazing authentication mechanisms that are available out there that you guys are all aware of. But Robert and Wilbert called out what we needed to know. You need two different factors. The reason for that is if someone got the information out of my head somehow, maybe I wrote down the username and then I was an idiot and wrote down the password right next to it. Really easy to capture that, but when they're two separate, it adds a lot of security there. Okay, so we show our identification. The authentication piece links that to us. Then we go to authorization. I know who you are. What are you allowed to do? Are you allowed to access this resource? And when you get to it, what are you allowed to do with it? That's going to be the other important piece. Authorization is probably, and authentication are the two pieces we'll talk about most today. And then accountability. Once you have access to that resource, I want to make sure I know what you are doing when you're doing it. This is in case of incidents. It's also in case for just good change management as well. If you're going to perform an action on the firewall, people should be aware of that. And we can't just make those sort of changes ad hoc. So accountability is important. I'm going to pause and I'm going to throw out the term non-repudiation. What do the terms non-repudiation and accountability have to do with each other? Who wants to shout out? Accountability and non-repudiation. Sarah, yeah, I'd love, you know the answer. I know that.
Yeah, I was waiting for somebody else to, raise their hands first. So if nobody wants to take it, so non-repudiation is basically you cannot deny having performed an action or done a task. And that helps with accountability because you're held accountable for your actions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I see Robert put something in the chat of using a digital signature. We've been talking a lot about digital signatures and PKI over the last couple of weeks. And there's one piece of PKI we'll address today. But one thing I want to call out that is important to be aware of with the concept of non-repudiation is it can work both from a sender perspective and a recipient perspective, depending on how you use different types of keys. So in the case of public key infrastructure, if I want to make sure that when I send an email to Vincent, he knows it's from me, I need to encrypt that key with the key that only I could encrypt it with, the only key I should have access to, my private key. Because then when he decrypts it using my public key, then he knows I'm the only one that could have encrypted it. Only Josh should have his private key. So that gives non-repudiation from the sender perspective. It also can work with the recipient perspective. So I want to send Vincent an email and I want to make sure if he opens it, he's the only one that can open it and that he couldn't deny that he was the one that opened it, to have that accountability and non-repudiation. So what we could do in that situation is just reverse what keys we're using. Vincent should be the only one that can open it. So I want to sign it with the opposite key of that. So he's going to decrypt it with his private key. The only key that he should be able to do is he's the only person that has it. So if I encrypt it with his public and it gets decrypted, I know Vincent was the one that decrypted it. So it can work in both ways. You just have to be aware of whose key you're going to use to lock it down in that sense. Okay. So I just wanted to go over those terms so we're all on the same page. Does anyone have questions, clarification, different use cases, anything like that that they want to go over before we start taking this to the next level? All right, you guys know to speak up. So we're going to talk
Josh,
about,
one question.
Yeah, fire away, Sarah.
Okay, so with regards to accountability, since we also implement logging for that purpose, so we need to have like a strong authentication. So it means if we do not use PKI, just multi-factor authentication and logging should be enough to establish accountability, right?
Yeah, that's right. It should be able to in those, especially internally when you have systems that can coordinate a little bit more effectively. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if I send Vincent something that requires multi-factor to open, it's another way of validating and authenticating that he is who he says he is. And then we can use things like logs to provide for accountability. So yeah, there's multiple methods that we could use for this. And that's a great point because on the exam, they might present you with both of those methods. If you want to send something with non-repudiation, what is the best option? And they might have both of those options listed in there. Well, you could use multi-factor authentication and logging, or you could use PKI. And they'll use other keywords in that scenario that clue you in on what the right answer is. So great thinking bringing that up, Sarah. That's a great point of clarification. Okay, we're going to discuss single sign-on and federated identity together. These concepts can kind of get mixed up sometimes, but there's a couple of points in here that will really help distinguish them, I think. And we're going to go through some diagrams as well to illustrate these. But taking a step back, our process that we're going to be discussing today, and almost all of these protocols, is I'm a user. In fact, let me go back to this slide here. I'm a user. I want to gain access to some resource and do some action. Other terms you'll hear for this is I'm a subject, and I want to do something with an object. Those are terms, official terms you'll see sometimes in test questions. And a subject is active in the scenario. They're going out and doing something. Doesn't always have to be a person. It could be a server just reaching out to authenticate. The object is passive. What is happening? So if I'm working with an identification server, I'm the subject and my credentials or that server is the actual object there. So the big picture process for all of these, usually it starts with a form of identification. I show my ID, my credentials, something to a server that helps identify me. And then it authenticates me as well. So identify and authenticate. You are who you say you are. You're part of this organization. Now we need to figure out, are you allowed to do stuff? So in this process here, there often is a token that is issued. And we'll see this happen pretty quickly. But you authenticate, they validate who you are, you get a token, or in the case of Kerberos, it's called a ticket. It goes by different names, but the principle is the same. And you can show that token or ticket around to anything that's a part of the official ecosystem of single sign-on, of federated identity. We'll be going into Radius and TACAX and Kerberos, all the same principle. I am who I say I am, so I get a token. Now I can go do whatever that token allows me to do until it expires, and then I go through that process again. So single sign-on, you're authenticating one time, and you can get access to multiple resources. The key point to this is it's within a single domain. This is where it gets a little bit confusing, and it's the main distinction between single sign-on and federated identity. And someone from the last group brought up a really easy example of this. Your personal Google account, or your work Google account even. When I log into Google, I have access to the Google environment. I have access to Google Drive, Google Calendar, Google Meets, like we're on right now. And when I log in to Google one time, I get access to that full suite. I don't have to log in again when I go to Google Calendar. That's single sign-on. I'm using one authentication mechanism to gain access to a bunch of different resources that are within the same domain. I'm going to come back to this single sign-on slide in a moment, but I really want to make sure the difference is clear here. Because federated identity, we start to bring in other organizations outside of our company domain. So in the example of Google, I have a Google account, and maybe I go sign up for another service. I use Notion a lot. If I went to sign up for a Notion account, it might have a pop-up saying, hey, do you want to authenticate using Google? This is an example of federated identity, not single sign-on, because it's involving an external organization. Now we have Google plus some other service provider. So they need to have a pre-existing relationship in order for federated identity to work. So when you go to log in or start that other service, it uses your Google authentication to determine what resources you can access or what objects you can interact with. So that's the key distinction. Single sign-on, only one domain, it's internal. Federated identity, we're starting to branch out and working with other organizations, and we need to have pre-established relationships with them. So let me go back to this slide, and I'm going to exit out of full screen, and let's go take a look at the diagram. Really simple, but again, let's take a step back. Don't get confused by the different boxes or such. All we're doing is we're going to some service and we're saying, this is who I am, authenticate me. They're either approving or denying us, and if they approve us, they're going to give us a token. We can then use that token to do whatever that service is configured to set us up with, and then the token will expire or go away at some point, and we'll have to start a new session. Is a term you'll hear throughout today too, a session. So we have our user and client, us. We're going to go authenticate. In this example, let's use Google. Our Google credentials are going to get sent to the single sign-on identity provider. We have to manage our identities somehow or another. That's another thing we're going to talk about. Things like LDAP. Who can tell me what LDAP stands for? Yeah, Ryan, fire away.
The lightweight active directory protocol.
Pretty close. You're almost there. Someone jump in. You got like one word wrong. Who can jump in with that? Lightweight directory. Yeah, Sarah.
Authentication protocol.
Authentication. Yeah, there we go. Lightweight directory authentication protocol. That's the identification piece. In some circumstances, there's other ways to provide that we'll talk about, but we reach out to SSO. Maybe it reaches out to LDAP. Probably not in the case of something as big as Google, but we'll take that as a scenario. If we authenticate successfully, Google will give us a token. This token is what allows us to, instead of just signing into Google and then going into Calendar and also signing on, we just present that token. This token helps us create a session. Tokens and sessions are not synonymous, and you don't have to use them together. There's other ways to facilitate a session, and there's other uses of tokens where session might not be the correct term, but they're closely linked. Who's willing to step up and tell us a little bit about what a session is, and maybe linking the word token? Just big picture. I want to understand what's going on. Yeah, Sarah, go for it. You're on mute if you're speaking, Sarah.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. So since token has a certain expiry, so I'm assuming session is associated with that. Until the token expires, you can have like a continuous session with that service provider.
That's exactly right. It's the term we use to say, okay, you've already authenticated, so now you just have to present your token. You don't have to re-authenticate every single time. You're within a session that you've pre-established. It's the same sort of concept of when you go through the three-step handshake. When you're setting up a session, communication, same thing with PKI. You do your asynchronous encryption. You go like Diffie-Hellman exchange, and then you have a session established, and you can go with synchronous encryption. It's the same principles being applied in different ways. So we have our token that gets granted to us. We are officially in a session. This is our session loop here. We have access is granted, so we can, wherever we want to go then, that's within that organization, we just present our token and we get access to whatever we need. When the session goes away, and this could happen through an error, could happen through an expiration time, it could happen through numbers of uses. There's a variety of different ways that tokens could be expired or gotten rid of. But once that goes away, then we restart that authentication process. So Google is going to time you out and make you re-log in. That's what's going on. Your token has expired, and you now need to re-authenticate through that so that you can start a new session. Sarah, did you have a question or something to add?
Yes, I have a question about this flow. So once a token is issued, I'm assuming that it's given to the client. And does the client present that token to the service provider? And
Yes.
And the token is then like resent to the identity provider by the service provider, is it? Or the
Yeah.
service provider in the initial, like when it's created, it shares it with the service provider for whenever it's needed?
That's
I'm
exactly.
confused about that.
Yeah. So when here, let me even just make a little example token. Let's just make a little token here so we can watch where we're going. Look at that beautiful token. Okay. So yeah, you get your token issued from the identity provider. You go and authenticate, you present your credentials. If you need to do multi-factor authentication, then you go through that step. They provide you a token. The token, when you are making your request, I want to access Gmail. I want to log into Google Drive and edit a file. It gets passed to the service provider. This would be Gmail, it would be Google Calendar, and then it is used to pass that information back to you. The token itself doesn't carry that. The token is just essentially your authentication proof. It's proving that you've already authenticated. So you get your resources, and then anytime you want a new resource, when you're in the middle of this session, you would go reach out to that service provider, accessing google.com, and you would just present your token, and that would serve as your authentication of, okay, you've already authenticated, so we can just work together normally now. It just replaces having to put your username and password every time you want to do that. Does that answer your question, Sarah? I want to make sure I was understanding that. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about federated identity. Let's go through, since we're right here, let's go through our process flow, and then we can go back to our slides and wrap up there. Take a step back. The process is exactly the same. We're just starting to add external identities in. Again, I just want to have you guys keep these simple in your mind. You're going to authenticate in some way. You're going to get presented some sort of a token that proves you've already authenticated, and you're going to use that token to access resources. So it's the same concept as single sign-on. We're a user in domain A. Remember, federated identity involves external organizations. That's the biggest distinction I want you guys to have in mind. External organizations for federated identity. We are going to reach out to our identity provider. Similar to here, identity providers. We are, instead of sending it to just a regular service provider that would be internal to our organization or internal to the organization that we're accessing, we're instead going to send it to the service provider of the other organization. It doesn't need to be complicated, because all this is doing is saying, instead of going from identity provider to our service provider, it's going from our identity provider to their service provider. It's the only difference. We're reaching out, we're logged into google.com, and we want to go access notion.com. So we have to reach out to our service provider in domain B. Now, there's a step that isn't really listed here, but it's this process of issuing a token. So you're authenticating here, and that's when you actually get your token, is throughout this identification and authorization process. So then your token, along with your request for whatever you're wanting to access, is sent to the service provider in the other organization. So here, when you're setting up a session initially, or if you're reestablishing a session that has expired or gone away otherwise, we're going to take this route here. So we'll mark this in orange, and we'll mark this in green real quick. So you've reached out to the service provider and shown them your token. They need to validate, do we trust this other organization? If you're coming from joeschmo.com to google.com, is there a trust relationship? There might not be. Again, federated identity, you have to have these pre-existing relationships set up and mapped. Do I trust this other organization? Am I going to allow my users to sign on with me and have free access to this other stuff without needing to sign on again? So if there is no trust relationship, the access is denied. Easy to figure out there. We haven't set up federated identity, or you're not authorized to view these resources, even though you have a token. Why, if I have a token, might I get an access denied on either of these, whether I'm in a session or not? When, in what circumstances might a token not work for me if I'm trying to access a resource? Who's got some ideas? It's not a trick question at all.
And no purpose is no privilege.
Yeah, no privilege, no purpose, things like that. Really easy. If I don't have the right permissions, if I'm trying to access a firewall and I'm not a systems administrator, if I'm in sales, I'm going to get access denied. I have a token, but it's not the right kind of token. Tokens carry with them different attributes and permissions that help them understand what they're allowed to do. So that's why you can get access denied on some of these. There's still a validation. You're authenticated. We need to validate, what are you authorized to view? So there you can see we're bringing in an authorization step here as well. Okay, so if there is a trust relationship existing, I'm logged into Google, I go to joeschmo.com, they have federated identity set up. Awesome, access is granted. Now my session has been established with them. Sessions with external providers don't usually last as long for security reasons, because you're kind of getting, in a sense, keys to the kingdom. Same thing with single sign-on. One set of credentials that you're starting to rely on more and more. You're looking at single points of failure more and more, which is why token security and session security is really important. So once we have a session established, then it's kind of similar. When we are logged in, we go through the authentication process with our own organization. We send some sort of a request for information to service provider in another organization. It goes directly to their service provider. Since we already have a token, we don't have to go through this process again with service provider B. And then it's the same thing. Do we get the resource or not? It's just a matter of whether we have to go through this verification step with the other provider. So let's go back to our slides and let's review them, and then let's see if we have some questions to go over. So SSO and federated identity, we're authenticating once. Federated identity, we might need to authenticate with another provider once we get our token. But we're authenticating once for single sign-on. It's centralized. We're going to one point, our identity provider, and validating that. It is convenient. It's also secure in a sense, because as long as we do a good job of protecting that set of credentials using really good multi-factor authentication, for example, then we can lean on it a little bit more. So there can be reduced security if you don't do it correctly. And then for federated identity, oops, I need to scroll down here. Multiple domains. It's really what I want you to focus on. It's cross-organizational. So do you guys, I see Sarah has her hand raised, but before we go on to the protocols that help support these mechanisms, Sarah, I see you have your hand raised, but yeah, if anyone has questions, pop up.
Yes, I do have a question. So in federated identity, like we saw in the flow chart that you shared, so when we receive the token, how does that trust relationship work? Are we going to get that verified from the identity provider, send it back to them to verify? Are we just going to trust them inherently? I don't see any verification going on.
Between the two organizations?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Great question. Yeah, so behind the scenes, there are some of these protocols that we're going to go into next that help facilitate that. They're behind the scenes for what can this user actually do. Yes, they've authenticated, but they need to authenticate against something. So like an LDAP directory. Well, we need to check that they're actually in there, do their credentials match? And then now that we've done the identity piece, the authentication piece. So there might be the multi-factor authentication. When we start moving down to federated identity, we've authenticated internally and we've gotten some token. And when we reach out externally, there's that similar authentication mechanism that's taking place. However, I mentioned in federated identity, we have to have those, they have to have a pre-existing relationship. So at some point in time, Google.com and Canva.com sat down together and said, hey, we want to work together. We want to have federated identity. So if someone logs onto Google, they can share permissions and things like that with Notion and get access to everything that they need to there without logging into both. But they have to map those different permissions and capabilities between the organizations. So if you have a set of permissions in your own organization, that would map to something similar in theirs. So there's a validation piece that's taking in the middle using some of these protocols that we're going to talk about next. I don't know if they'll explain it in much detail because we're not going to look at the different like SAML. We'll talk about SAML today. That is the main thing that's helping with single sign-on. And it has a language, a markdown language, where it's helping to clarify what those permissions are. And that's how the organizations are communicating those back and forth. Okay, organization A user wants to come work with us. What can they do? What can they not do? And then they enforce those permissions there. The token carries those around, essentially saying, hey, this is the user, these are their attributes, this is what they're allowed to look at or not allowed to look at. Does that answer your question, Sarah? I don't know if it does or not. I want to make sure it does.
Yeah, somewhat. I think once we study those protocols, probably it will make things more clear. I'll wait for that.
I think you're right. If it doesn't, then please let me know and reach out. Yeah, Cliff, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, so if I can, and I'm already looking at OAuth, so sorry for jumping ahead, but
that's okay.
I have a scenario, and maybe you could express what you may believe it is. Say you have on-prem servers and domains, so that's going to be single sign-on. However, your electronic medical records are cloud-based by another provider. However, when you sign on, and you don't have to re-sign on to the EMR, what would that be using?
You're looking at it. OAuth. That's exactly right. We need a way to share resources between organizations without authenticating every single time. And that's what OAuth does for us. So before I jump into OAuth, I'm ready to dive in there. But Deepu, I see you raise your hand as well. Did you have a question with SSO or federated identity or whatever we're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, I had a question back to the tokens.
Yeah.
So the diagram that you had for federated identity, Yeah, so this is just a sample flow, right? It's not so it depends on the protocols, how exactly the data flows across the different components. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so this is
Great
so
call.
just to answer Sarah's question. This is just a sample flow. It doesn't have to be this way. It depends on the protocols.
And here's a more generic example of this life cycle. It could be token. If I put ticket in here, it would be very similar to Kerberos. Again, all of these things that are happening on the back end look the same. We have some authentication and identification step, and that's what gives us our token. Okay, you've already authenticated. We know who you are. Your token is going to carry your permissions around. You've started a session, so you don't have to go through that identification and authorization piece every time. So once we've actually gone through that step, now we can use the token. So we reach out to use some resource, any resource. It's going to validate the token, validate things like our permissions. Are we allowed to do what we're asking to do? Yes, we have a token. Is it the right kind of token? So we can go through that process as much as we need to. There is an expiration that can take place, in which case we just need to go back up here and start a new session. There's a renewal process. You know, sometimes there's things in Google where you don't necessarily have to sign in, but it's like stay signed in. If you click this, it'll renew your token. It's okay, you're still there. Your session doesn't need to expire. So your token might get refreshed, could also get revoked. There might be some security issue. Again, it could just expire. There might be, there's reasons you could revoke a ticket, but you go through this cycle. This is the session cycle here. So we're going to go in this loop. I want to access a resource. We're going to validate my token. It's not expired. We don't need to refresh. We go up and I want to use it again. And we're just going to go round and around, and then it'll eventually expire and it'll end. And the next time we want to do the same thing, we'll go through the identification and authentication stage again and go into that cycle. This is true big picture of, again, everything we're talking about today. Federated identity, single sign-on. I'm going to just scroll through. Don't get distracted by here. OAuth, it supports that. OpenID Connect, it supports that process. SAML supports that process. It's the language behind the scenes that is making this happen. Kerberos, same process. They just use different terms. They use a ticket granting service instead of the term tokenization. Password authentication protocols, well, that's a little bit different here. Deepen, same thing. LDAP used to support this process. It's the identification and authorization piece. Sometimes the authorization piece, more identification. PKI, a little bit different there, but it's a lot of these protocols are used to support PKI. Radius, absolutely. TACAX plus, absolutely. Diameter, absolutely. So the specifics of this process might look a little different. Instead of in here, a user authenticating to domain A, if we're talking about Kerberos, instead of federated identity, this would be your authentication server. And then this might be your, somewhere in this stage, could be your ticket granting service. Same concepts. We're using the same cybersecurity techniques to accomplish the same end. It's just showing up in different flavors. Okay. How are we feeling, guys? Let me just pause and check in. Are we doing good? You guys ready to move on to OAuth? Who can tell me what OAuth stands for? There's a keyword here that might clue you into what OAuth stands for. Open authentication. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so we are going to, Cliff already brought up an excellent point. I work for an organization and I want to be able to access data, information, get access to resources, objects. I'm a subject and I want to access an object. How do I do that without using my credentials every single time? So we've talked about federated identity and SSO. open authorization is another framework that works alongside those at times. And what it does is it enables us to share resources across organizations without needing to use our authentication process again. So it does the authorization piece of the authentication. So we've gone and identified ourselves and we've gotten our token. Open authorization works to make sure that we're actually authorized to use those. You've gotten your token, you're validated, so now you can access these external resources. Let me give you a clear example of how you've seen open authorization works, because it's enormously enormously popular in web applications, enormously popular in APIs especially, because we're exchanging data, but we don't want to authenticate every time. We might use keys or other ways to establish a secure connection. And those come from the identification and authentication steps that we've already gone through at this stage. So the authorization is what this brings in. So I'm signed into google.com and I want to access information from another provider. Let's say it's Dropbox. I want to have my Google and Dropbox talk together. So I use an integration. There's an API that's behind the scenes. It's communicating between these two identities, these two governances, Google, and in this case, Dropbox. And they're using open authorization supported by Federated Identity. We've gone through the identification and authentication steps. Now we're on to authorization. So open auth, once we've gone through that process, you get that pop-up that says, hey, Dropbox is asking permission to access your files and access your name, things like that. You'll get that pop-up asking for permissions. That's open auth at play. It's saying, do we have the authorization to perform these actions behind the scenes when you have set up a session properly? So let's pause and let's go back to our slide here real quick so you can see where open authorization fits into this cycle. You've created your token. You are now wanting to work with this provider. The token validation step is kind of where this is taking place. So OpenAuth is behind the scenes saying you've validated, you've gone through the identification and the authentication piece. Remember, there's this flow. You've identified and you've authenticated. Now we need to know, are you authorized to do what you're asking us to do? So in the case of Google and Dropbox, I'm on google.com and I want to import a file from Dropbox to Google Drive. I don't want to download it and then upload it. I don't want to go log into Dropbox and then transfer it. I don't want to touch Dropbox. So as long as I have Federated Identity set up with them and I provided those permissions, then the open authorization framework is behind the scenes, essentially supporting the attributes of this token, saying, is this guy validated or authorized to do what he's asking to do? So we can now share resources. So I can say, yes, Dropbox has those permissions. When I want to import a file, since they have that relationship, Federated Identity is established, and I've authorized them to work together, then the authentication, identification, and authorization pieces are all accounted for. And then Sarah has brought up the ways that accountability could be taking place in the back end. So that's open authorization. And we've discussed sessions a little bit. I want to pause and ask you guys this question about stateful and stateless systems. We hear this most often on a firewall. That's mostly where you'll hear those terms used. Who wants to take a chance and tell me, in that context of a firewall, what does stateful and stateless mean? And why would tokens have anything to do with that at all? Who's got an idea? Stateful. Okay, Sarah, tell me why you think it's stateful.
Because they are passed around in an established session, so they help us with maintaining information about that state of communication, which is going on with that destination or service provider.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So the way that you're presenting that information is correct. It actually is stateless. I see Roshan put it in stateless. And it's interesting because it kind of is stateful in the sense that we had a session. There has to be some sort of pre-existing session that's established. And we're used to hearing that concept in stateful. So a stateful firewall, when traffic passes out, there's something that's left open for that traffic to come back in. There's a session essentially that's established. So it can be a little confusing when we talk about tokens because it actually is stateless. So let's go back and just refresh our memory on why that is. So I'm going to use, yeah, we can use this. Okay, so we've gone through our identification and authorization stages. Stateful, it would need to remember our token every time. It would need to keep track of the token. It doesn't need to have any memory of the session because of the token. So the token almost acts as our stateful piece, but the rest of the system is stateless because every time I want to access a resource, I have to present my token. That resource has no memory of my token. It doesn't care if I've accessed it before. It's going to validate me every single time, and it's going to validate my token every single time. So it's a confusing concept because it looks stateful in that we have a session established, but the only stateful piece is really just that we have a token. Stateless, Robert put in the chat that it's better for performance, and that's absolutely right. It's also better for security in this sense because we have to go through that validation piece every single time. And it's not a lot of overhead. It is easier than having a session stay open on an external server while you're communicating and using a token. It just isn't needed. So I'm really proud of you for speaking up, Sarah, because you nailed it. It's exactly right. It looks so stateful, but it actually is stateless, just depending on where you look. So great job at that. All right, let's go back to our slides. So we've talked about open authorization. Oh, whoops. So let's discuss OpenID Connect. We're going to kind of skim over this topic a little bit. OpenID Connect can tack on top of Open Authorization 2.0. That's the important thing I want you to be aware of. So remember, Open Authorization, it's authorization. We've already gone through the identification and the authentication stages. Well, OAuth helps us with the authorization. OpenID Connect tacks on top and re-brings in the identification piece. I'll be frank, I don't quite understand how these work together very well, other than what I want you to understand. OpenID Connect works in tandem with Open Authorization to provide for identification better. So I don't know if anyone else has a stronger understanding of OpenID Connect and how it's used or why it's used within that. But the important thing to note here is it actually uses a separate token for identification. So we actually have multiple tokens going on at this stage. So we're not going to focus on that point, but I just want you to be aware of, in the same sense that when we're sending emails back and forth and we're using the public key infrastructure, we can have multiple types of encryption going on. We might encrypt the body of the email differently than we encrypt the hash or the message digest. So we might use different keys. Same sort of concept here. We're going to use different tokens to account for different principles of the CIA Triad or this identity, authentication, authorization, and accountability aspects too. So you guys, do you have any questions? I probably won't answer them now, but ask away and I can jot them down on my list for OpenID Connect. This is an area of weakness that I want to learn more about. Deepu added that OpenID Connects adds a thin layer of authentication on top of OAuth. Okay, so awesome. Thank you, Deepu. It adds identification and a little bit of that authentication stage too. Seems like it adds another layer of security, because I've heard the concept defense in depth of maybe we go through that identification and authentication piece inside our domain, but just an extra little layer when we authenticate outside of our domain too. Yeah, Sarah, go ahead. Let me back up that.
Okay, so I'm a bit confused about this because even with OAuth, there was some authentication taking place before the authorization was given, like to the other service provider. So how is this different from that?
I don't have a strong
So
answer
Josh,
for you, Sarah. Yeah, go ahead. If you have a better answer, I'd love to hear it.
yeah, so Sarah, as far as I know, again, I'm not an expert on this. So just read up on this in my teaching sessions. I've never really implemented it. So I'm not saying it from the perspective of a practitioner, but from whatever I have read and understood of OAuth, OAuth is just to do with authorization. Okay, so there is no authentication. It's just to do with authorization.
I mean, I do read that here, but how can we give authorization to an entity like without performing the authentication? I mean, it was there because when Josh was explaining, I think we were probably talking about two different entities which were working in
Oh.
like the same federation, and we did get
Yeah.
authenticated, and then the authorization was given for some specific services.
Yes.
So it was already there. So how
No,
is
no, no.
Open IT? Yeah.
So when you build a system, you don't just build it on one protocol, right? You build it on several protocols. They do a lot of different things. So in that, think about a system where authentication is handled, let's say using, I don't know, let's say using, let's say federated identity. Okay, authentication is handled using federated identity, and authorization is handled using OAuth. So authentication is there, but the protocol that was used for authentication is not OAuth. It was something else.
So I'm going to jot up some. I have this jotted down on my question list because it's a great question. Deepu, thanks for jumping in and helping us understand this a little bit better. My understanding is still too weak to go much deeper on this. So similar to how at the beginning of this session I presented some resources, I have something jotted down here of just understanding how OpenID connects fits into this picture with open authorization a little bit better. So I'll get you a better answer for that, Sarah, and post it in the community. Yeah, great question though, because that's
Thank
again
you.
that's a gap in my knowledge too. So let's jump to SAML. So for some of these next concepts, we're going to skim a little bit lightly because I want to make sure we have some time for practice questions. SAML is the language, especially for SSO, that is used. So again, internally, that is used for communicating a lot of this information behind the scenes. It's a markup language. So if you go look at the packets that are happening and what those packets are building up, that's what it is. So it's an open standard. So organizations can use it to a degree to work together, but mostly systems will be set up to communicate using this. We'll try and access an app. We'll go to an identity provider. We'll authenticate. In this stage, there's a key happening behind the scenes, or a token happening behind the scenes. SAML doesn't necessarily give you the token. It's just what's communicating all of this information. It's that the information is presented in security assertion markup languages. So when I go to an identity provider, I have an assertion. This is my identity. This is my name, maybe my credentials. It might have things like my organization or permissions on there. And then the token happens within here in the response. So I'm not going to spend much more time on there. If you have more questions on that, I would just do some more research and studying on your own would be my best encouragement. Kerberos, likewise, we are not going to, yeah, Sarah, go ahead if you have a question.
Okay, so since OpenID Connect and SAML, they're providing the same functionality. So if we're given a scenario question that we have to pick one over the other.
Mm.
So yeah, so can you Yeah, if you can explain in which scenario one is preferred over the other.
Yes, I'm gonna pause and I'm gonna skip ahead and show you guys a slide that's kind of towards the end of our conversation that I hope will help with that. Because this was confusing for me because there's so many of these protocols. And yeah, if we take a step back, they all work the same way, but it was difficult for me to understand what is complementary versus what are alternatives. And you can see in some of these cases, it's both. We haven't talked about TACAX or Radius yet, but TACAX can be complementary to Radius or it can replace Radius. So in some of these, you'll see LDAP. And where's the other one we're talking about? Oh, I don't see OpenID Connect actually on here, Sarah. I don't see OpenID Connect on here. So I'm gonna jot down that I need to just review my chart here too.
Josh, have you shared this chart anywhere?
Have I shared, what was that, Deepu?
This particular chart that we're looking at?
No, this is something I just came up with over this last week. So I will share this out, but someone pointed out on Tuesday that there was another protocol that was missing on this chart too, mostly just for space, but I'll publish something that's a little bit more usable.
Sure.
To Sa's question, right? One thing I know, right? SAML, you can use, I mean, it should be a centralized authentication, and OpenID can be decentralized authentication.
Okay, that's a great point. Centralized SAML, SSO inside of our circle, that makes sense versus OpenID Connect and Open Authorization. These are lean more external. So that's a great call out, Sravanan. Thank you. So Sarah, let's jump back to your question just briefly. When would we want to use one over the other? SAML, better for internal use, better for single sign-on, which is just one domain. Open Authorization is more external. We're working with other domains. We're using Federated Identity now. So Open Authorization helps us to share resources without having to authenticate every time, cross domain. And then OpenID Connect, we have some confusion on, but it adds another layer of security is what we do know. And then SAML, again, just to reiterate, it's for internal, and SSO is a primary use. So I will have some more information on that maybe is more helpful with that chart, but thanks for calling that out, Sravanana. You're exactly right there. Okay, there are a lot of resources out there surrounding Kerberos. Kerberos was confusing to me until I was able to take a step back and realize that it's the same process getting played over and over again. It just uses some different terminology. Kerberos, internal again. Think internal. It often works with LDAP. It's often used with Active Directory as well. And it's authentication, you can see behind the scenes, and it's a secure way of authenticating using the same mechanism. I'm going to authenticate once, get a token. In this case, it's called a ticket. And I'm going to use that ticket to do whatever I'm authorized to do. So you can see this is an authentication protocol, not an authorization protocol necessarily. There are other protocols that we're going to bring in to support this, to support the authorization or accountability pieces. So with this, we have our user. Our user is going to reach out to an access control server, an identity server, and it's going to be granted what's called a ticket granting ticket. Think of that like your token, essentially. Or a token that makes tokens almost. So then you go to the individual service that you want and you say, hey, I have my ticket granting ticket, my token granting token. I want a token specifically to work with you as a resource. So again, still within an internal organization. Then we sort of have a session established and we have access to that. We at this point have a ticket to work with that particular resource or service. We also still have our ticket granting ticket, so we can go and reach out to other services if we want to establish more sessions. So I have a slide that has this illustrated that we'll jump to next, but Kerberos is single domain, internal. There are ways where it can be expanded for external use, but it's by using a lot of these other protocols and workarounds. So think internal when you think Kerberos. If you see Active Directory, oftentimes Kerberos is at play for the authentication mechanism. Kerberos can be used with other protocols as well. So it can be used with LDAP, I think I mentioned. So we'll circle back to that piece. This is the map of how things are going to happen. So we're our clients, and we're going to log in to a system. So the first step here, I know it says authentication server, so it's kind of giving it away, but there's 2 steps that are actually happening in this, just in point 1 and 2 in this exchange. Out of our IAAA, what is happening in steps 1 and 2? Someone shout out and tell me. Cliff, I see your hand raised. I don't know if that was a question or if you have the answer ready for us.
Actually, it's a feedback on something that Kerberos was expressed in another area I saw. It's like for printers, Kerberos is used because it's all inside the same domain.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
authenticated that way, which made me realize it's more constrained to a single domain, Active Directory, close to LDAP.
Yeah, absolutely. In this case, LDAP would kind of be this mix here. Could be an authentication server, but the authentication server might reach out to LDAP to gather the identification and validate credentials. Let's see, Sarah, you had your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm saying, just building upon what Cliff said. So the server to which we're actually requesting service, it can be any kind of service, I'm assuming, within that domain. It
Yeah.
can be a printer or any database server, any other server which is basically serving us.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. So just to go a little deeper on that, we have our clients. I'm going to pretend instead of client, this says subject, because it doesn't always have to be the person here. It could be this computer, or it could be another server. We have our subject, and it wants to go do something. So it needs to authenticate. So it'll reach out with credentials. Pretend this is an LDAP server. We have the username credentials or a hash of the credentials or some equivalent. So we need to validate the identification piece. Okay, they've identified and authenticated. So now we have proven our authentication, and we're going to go and take that authentication. I think there's a token behind the scenes or the equivalent of a token with a different term. And you go to your ticket granting server. This whole section is just your key distribution center. It's where you get your tickets and where you're doing your authentication. Once you get your ticket granting ticket back, so you see TGS, ticket granting server, the ticket granting server is going to grant you a ticket granting ticket. And then anytime you want to go work with a server, and there can, like Sarah called out, there can be multiple servers that you want to work with within an organization. You reach out, and this 5 and 6, 5, you're presenting your ticket granting ticket. 6, they're giving you a ticket to work with that specific server. So I'm going to go through this real quick one more time using the word token. Kerberos is tickets, but again, this is the same exact thing we've been talking about. We authenticate and we do our identification stages. So we're granted some token, in this case a ticket. And then anytime we want to go do something, we just present that token, and we don't have to authenticate again. We're just checking the authorization step at this point now. So the authorization piece is where we'll bring in other protocols. Okay, and that's like SAML where it would come in. So open authorization, if this were not Kerberos and be external, this stage would be taking place using open authorization. In this case, it's probably SAML internally. Okay, so that's Kerberos in a nutshell. Again, there's so many resources and great videos about this. If you have a question or are missing resources, reach out. But I'm confident you guys can study this well on your own. All right, I see that we're coming a little bit short on time, and I do have a hard out at the top of the hour, unfortunately, because I love to go over. You guys know that. So I'm going to kind of blaze through these last couple of concepts so that we can get to a couple of practice questions before we leave. So password authentication protocol. It's plain text. That's the biggest thing you need to know. Where does it say plain? Plain text transmission. The two-way handshake. I send my credentials, plain text. They have my actual password. They check it. Is it good? Yes. All right, you're in. Password authentication protocol is very deprecated. It was replaced by CHAP, Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol. Instead of a two-way handshake, me passing the credentials and them passing me back that, yep, you're good to go, we have three-way handshake. So we talked a couple of weeks ago when we were working with encryption about the concepts of an initialization vector or a nonce or a salt, all elements of adding randomness to help make sure that our hashes turn out differently every single time. So we're not subject to some of those hash attacks. That's what's happening in this step. The challenge is where, okay, I reach out to a server, I want to establish a session. So the challenge is the server is going to send me that piece of randomness, an initialization vector or something like that. I am going to use that piece of randomness, and I'm going to take a hash of it along with my password, and I'm going to send it back to the server. So my password never gets transmitted at all. A hash of it plus randomness went back to the server, and the server verifies. It knows my password, and it knows the randomness, so it performs that same operation and validates that the hashes actually do match. So that's all that's happening. Password no longer needs to get communicated over in transit at all. EAP and PEEP. Now we're talking about network access. We've been talking a lot about accessing resources, going to a server maybe to access files, working together across domains. So all of those things can work at the same time with EAP and PEEP, Extensible Authentication Protocol. And then PEEP is the same concept, just encrypted. We see this a lot with protocols having the insecure version and then the secure. HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, SFTP. It's the same concept. So the difference in the encryption part is that instead of information being clear text while we're establishing a session, that session, once it's set up, is put into a TLS tunnel that you see here. So with EAP, we just authenticate and we get access. It uses a similar challenge handshake response, but it's a little bit more flexible. With PEEP, we just put the whole thing in the TLS tunnel. So all of our communication is encrypted within this. So definitely the PAP and CHAP are deprecated. Let's see if I have any other notes I want to chat about here. Network access, I really want you to focus on the terms Wi-Fi, VPN, and network. That's when you're going to see EAP and PEEP pop up mostly. You're setting up a network, you're a manager responsible for just determining what architecture and protocols you want to use for users. You're establishing a Wi-Fi network and you want to process for validating users. Well, we have an authentication protocol now that we can put into play to authenticate users before they join our network. So we don't have time to go any deeper into this, but reach out if you have questions, please. And same thing here, we've talked about LDAP a little bit. What I want you to be aware of is that LDAP really helps with the identification piece especially. So Kerberos will use it because remember, Kerberos is authentication. LDAP can handle identification. So let's real quickly jump back. Oh no, I had our Kerberos slide up here. Let's just jump back here. LDAP would sit right in this database spot. So this whole process is Kerberos, but when Kerberos is going through this authentication process, it needs the identities stored somewhere. So we use the lightweight directory. And we have our database, and that's what's going on behind the scenes for LDAP. Let's get back down there. The couple of key terms or phrases in here are we have distinguished name, we have attributes, we have bind operation. When we're using directory information, if you are a user inside of like Active Directory or something like that, you have a set of attributes that's associated with you. When we're talking about LDAP, and working with forests or things like that, of organizing an enterprise, we need to have a way to map those together. Those are the distinguished names and the attributes. Who are you? Are you a computer? Are you a user? If you're a user, what kind of a user are you? That's all that's happening. It's a directory of those types of attributes behind the scenes. PKI. How does this relate? I'll just focus on this final little bullet here. You guys can read what's above, and we've talked about PKI quite a bit the last couple of weeks. PKI, public key infrastructure, when we're talking outside of an organization, globally, on the internet, we have a certificate authority. That certificate authority manages all of our public certificates. So our public certificates are managed by the certificate authority. That happens using IKE, Internet Key Exchange. That's what's happening in the big wide web. Now let's take this and tie it to LDAP, because LDAP is pretty much internal. It's inside of our organization. We can't have a global database, but we can have an organizational database. So we can create public key infrastructure, but instead of public meaning the interweb, the public means actually our intraweb, our internal organizational network. So we might have a certificate authority that we build and manage ourselves. I don't have to go to DigiCert for a certificate. I can make my own certificates. They're self-signed, they're not authoritative. Other people might not trust them yet, but I can do that. LDAP internally can help manage that. So instead of using IKE, Internet Key Exchange, LDAP can help facilitate internally where public keys are. If I want to send a message to Saravanan and he and I work for the same company and we use PKI inside of our company, LDAP is what's going to facilitate that. Radius. Okay, Radius again is mostly internal, and Radius focuses on the authentication, authorization, and accounting principles. So a Radius server, Radius is always hosted on the server, will also often use LDAP as the identification piece. So we need to find our identifications so that we can have some authorization or authentication mechanisms. I guess I have those. Oh, I do have those in that order. So in the also it's used in wireless networks, VPNs, and ISPs. So if we go here, oops, sorry, I should have gone back to Kerberos. Instead of Kerberos, we're going to pretend this is Radius. Just pretend with me. So the ticket granting server and the authentication server will be the same thing. These will combine and become a Radius server. When we are authenticating, we'll go to the Radius server and we provide our credentials, and the Radius server will go to the LDAP directory and say, hey, is this person actually in our directory? He is, yes, okay, great. Now we can authenticate him using Radius. So these protocols can work together. And pretend these servers are merged, and this is our Radius server. We reach out to authenticate. It reaches out to LDAP to validate the identification piece. And then we are authenticated and we get our token, essentially, for Radius. Same concept. So I know I'm going quickly because I really would love to have time to go through a couple practice questions. I don't know if we'll get there. Okay, Radius, I want you to think network access. I want you to think we need some form of authentication, authorization, and accounting for users. It's pretty basic, pretty flexible, and it's basic and flexible enough that we came up with TACAX Plus. Same concepts, but the key distinction here is TACAX Plus is way more granular. It's more difficult to set up because you're doing a lot more specific configurations. Radius, we're checking your ID, we're making sure you're part of our organization, we're checking some basic permissions, and you're in. TACAX Plus is like at the device level and even at the command level. This is more for systems administrators and would be a little bit too cumbersome for a full organization. So Radius and TACAX Plus can actually be used at the same exact time. They're not used together necessarily, intermixed, but they would be used distinctly. So the two cases that I'll throw out here. I'm not a systems administrator. I work in sales and I want to log into our Wi-Fi. chances are it's going to be Radius that's facilitating that. We just need to check your identity, make sure you're in our organization and that you're authorized to use the Wi-Fi, you're connected. TACACS Plus, this is more in the scenario that I'm a systems administrator. I want to go make changes to a Cisco firewall. Cliff just brought this out. We used a lot of times in this sort of a scenario. I still will maybe have the identity piece taken care of by LDAP. They still have to know who I am. But TACACS Plus, when I go to that firewall, is going to determine what I actually have permissions to do, again, down to the command level. So I might not be able to escalate my privileges if I'm not allowed to with TACACS Plus. Key distinction. Radius, general network access, usually internal. TACACS Plus, also pretty much just internal. But we're talking about device and command level granularity for access control. And diameter, I think this might be our last slide before practice questions. So diameter is a big time upgrade from Radius. It's way more flexible, can be used across organizations more easily. So again, Radius is better just for internal organizations. Diameter starts to expand this. It's used in very large enterprises typically. We're not going to go into much more depth on diameter. The things that I want you to be aware of is that diameter is an upgrade to Radius. And it can be tacked on top of Radius during a migration or an upgrade. So they can be used simultaneously linked together. The easiest comparison is like how IPv4 and IPv6 work. IPv6 is mitigating a huge problem with IPv4. We don't have enough available IP addresses. Diameter is similarly addressing deficiencies in Radius. It's just not big enough or not flexible enough for us to work with enormous environments. But IPv6 can get used alongside IPv4. I don't really touch IPv6 stuff because IPv4 is just mapped to it behind the scenes. Very similar with this. You can have radius and diameter tacked on top of each other. Important thing to note is if you do upgrade, so you get rid of radius and just use diameter, it's not backwards compatible. So you can't go back to radius without a major overhaul. So you can be radius and decide I want to move towards diameter, I'm going to tack it on top, and then you can decide to get rid of it later. You can use this at the same time as TACACS Plus. Again, TACACS Plus kind of has a specific use case with that systems administrator type role. Okay, guys, I literally only have a few minutes before I have to hop off here. So I'm going to share this chart out a little bit later so you guys can see this in the group and reference it. It's helpful to go and realize open authorization can be used with SAML. If we have internal stuff and we're working with external, OpenAuth and SAML might need to interconnect and talk with each other and translate information. Same thing here. We talked about diameter. It's complementary to radius when tacked on top. It's complementary to TACACS because it can be used separately. It also is an alternative to radius. So just being aware of the context of how these work together would be helpful. I'll update this with the missing protocols and get it published to Skool, though. I don't know if I'll get it today, but I'll get it before the end of the week for you guys. Okay, again, we just have a couple of minutes, guys. So I want to actually just skip forward to the practice questions I want to go through with you. So that's an easy, I'll skim through this. Primary goal for controlling access to assets, preserve confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I know it's one of the first things we mentioned when we started tonight's session. All of this, our whole job in cybersecurity is to preserve the CIA Triad. Are we ensuring that only valid objects can authenticate on a system? Well, this is actually meant to be subjects. Subjects are the one validating or actually performing actions. They're active. Preventing unauthorized access to subjects. Objects are passive, not subjects. So these are kind of trick answers here. And then ensuring that all subjects are authenticated, absolutely. But that is in support of the CIA Triad. All right, this is a good one. Which of the following is the best choice to support a federated identity management system? So who's got an idea of what this is? There's one trick answer. Yeah, Sarah, SAML, absolutely. This is how we support. Yeah, SAML is a little bit tricky. Open authorization is actually a strong answer as well. SAML in this context is the best choice that's available to us. SAML behind the scenes does use XML, but that's not what the question was. SAML would be the answer. Kerberos can only be used internally, so that would be used for single sign-on. So great job, guys. I see a lot of 4s popping up in there. LDAP, link it with user authentication and access control. It's the identification piece of that. That's the primary reason we would involve LDAP, is to support authentication and access control. Has nothing to do with NAT. I mean, it's not really web applications because it's internal, and LDAP doesn't do the encryption. There is a secure form of LDAP. I think it's LDAP S, or it's SLDAP. You guys know how that works. It's a secure form, but that's not what it asked. Okay, secure, scalable authentication in a modern web app, and we're using third party, not internal. We're working with other organizations, and we want authentication is the main piece. And we do care about secure and scalable. SAML, mostly internal for the most part. And it's not as scalable. And it's, when you hear web app, I want you to jump right to OAuth for the most part. This is what's sharing resources. Radius and TACACS, again, this is more internal. TACACS, not modern web applications. We wouldn't need to use it for that sort of a situation. So you guys got that perfect. Okay, this is the last thing I'm going to have time for, and I got to kind of pull up my work computer as I'm getting ready for this. So you guys go ahead. Your organization is in the process of deploying a new authentication infrastructure. Authentication. Your goal is to centralize authentication for network access and administrative access to network devices. Which of the following approaches would best meet the requirements? So you can see that we have radius for network access, TACACS for admin access is option 1. Diameter could replace radius. Keep in mind, it can also get tacked on over the top, but we could replace it. We could use radius for both, or we could use TACACS for both. And I see some ones being popped into the chat, and that's absolutely right. We can use radius and TACACS together. The radius will facilitate network access. It's simpler. We don't need a lot of complexity because we want it to be scalable. Isn't the word scalable in here? Scalable, and then the security focuses on these network devices. What commands can I run? So number 1 is correct. We can use both of these simultaneously. We just would manage them separately because they have completely different roles. Systems administrators, regular users. Diameter would be overkill for this situation, and it doesn't adequately address the nuances of both of these requests. There's a keyword "and" here. I know it's simple grammar, but it's asking you 2 pieces. The goal is to centralize user authentication for both network access and administration access to network devices. So I'm sorry I have to cut us off short there, guys, because I'll also share this slide out in the group as well. We're going to start logging continuing education units just at the end as we do a Q&A. So sorry we didn't have time to get that today, but I will be posting some of this in the Skool platform for you guys. So again, I'm so sorry I have to cut this short, but I got a work meeting I gotta jump into. So thank you for being with me, you guys. You guys are awesome. If you have questions, please reach out because I want to answer them. I just won't have time right now. So proud of you guys for studying. Keep it up. Keep it up. Thanks all.